while I was helping her sick mother. Her phone linked to the speaker. A male voice said, "Tell him you're seeing your sister. Come to the motel. I bought Viagra. My name is Patrick Hale. I'm 34, an internist at St. Mary's Hospital, and for the last 2 weeks I had practically been living in my fiancé's childhood home. Her mother, Margaret, had come down with pneumonia that turned nasty fast. We'd pulled her through the worst of it, but recovery for someone in her 60s isn't a matter of days, especially when there's diabetes and high blood pressure complicating everything. I was there most evenings after long hospital shifts, checking vitals, adjusting medication schedules, and cooking light meals because Margaret wasn't strong enough to stand for long stretches. On that Thursday night, I thought the hardest part of my evening would be chopping onions with my eyes half shut from exhaustion. Margaret sat bundled in the living room recliner, a wool blanket around her shoulders, while my fiancée, Eliza, scrolled through her phone on the couch. It felt almost normal, the three of us in that quiet house, me in the kitchen humming without much energy. Then the speaker on the counter crackled. Margaret coughed lightly, and I turned to make sure she was okay, but it wasn't her. The sound came from the Bluetooth speaker we used for radio. Without warning, Eliza's phone had linked automatically. A man's voice filled the kitchen, clear, slow, deliberate. "Think of something. Tell him you're seeing your sister. Come to the motel. I bought Viagra." For a moment, I didn't react. The words were too absurd, too grotesque, landing in the middle of simmering soup and Margaret's soft wheezing. But they kept echoing in my head. The speaker buzzed once more, then silence. Eliza froze in the living room, her phone in her hand like a gun that had gone off by mistake. Margaret lifted her head slowly, her face pale and stricken. She was sick, yes, but the expression on her face wasn't physical illness. It was recognition. I stepped out from behind the counter. My voice came out low, steady, the way I speak to panicked patients before procedures. "Who was that?" Eliza stammered, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She said it was a prank call, that her friends sometimes did stupid things. But Margaret let out a harsh breath, not quite a cough, not quite a sigh, and muttered that her daughter never had friends with that kind of humor. I pressed further, though not by shouting. I didn't need to. Silence weighed heavier than raised tones. Eliza's explanations stumbled over themselves. Wrong number, co-worker joking, maybe a scam. But the speaker had given away details that weren't random. Telling me she was visiting her sister wasn't a phrase that came out of nowhere. She used that excuse often. Her sister lived in another city, and she made regular trips there that I had never questioned. The confrontation lasted minutes, but felt like an hour. Margaret tried to rise, perhaps to stop the fight, but her legs shook. I steadied her, guided her back to the chair, and caught her eyes. There was sorrow there, and something else, confirmation that she, too, suspected the daughter she'd raised might be living a double life. Eliza insisted it was nothing, that she'd explain later, but then she grabbed her coat and walked out the door before either of us could stop her. Margaret sagged in the chair, clutching the blanket like armor. The room was filled with the faint smell of boiling broth and the loudest silence I'd ever known. I didn't follow Eliza that night. Part of me wanted to storm after her, demand names, addresses, explanations. But another part of me, the part that handles patients who deny chest pain while gripping their sternum, told me that raw confrontation rarely brings truth. People lie more when cornered. Margaret asked me, after a long pause, if I had known. I told her honestly I hadn't. Her breathing rattled faintly as she shook her head. She said she wasn't surprised. She had felt unease for months, though she'd chalked it up to her illness or a mother's paranoia. When Eliza claimed she had extra errands, late visits to her sister, or sudden phone calls that sent her into another room, Margaret hadn't asked questions. She didn't want to. Now, with the words from that speaker still hanging in the air, she wished she had. I went back to the soup, not because I was hungry, but because hands need tasks when the brain is spiraling. Knife against cutting board, spoon in pot, water running over dishes. All of it mechanical. My mind, however, replayed the voice. Male, middle-aged, confident. Not the voice of some teenager pulling a prank. And not the voice of a stranger testing random numbers. He had known enough to script her cover story. Later, when Margaret drifted into uneasy sleep, I sat in the dark kitchen and began to catalog the last 6 months. Every time Eliza had left suddenly, every time she had claimed her sister needed her, I thought about the way she had grown sharper, almost restless, when I talked about working double shifts or covering weekends. At the time, I had assumed it was frustration at my hours, the kind of thing many partners of doctors complain about. But maybe it wasn't loneliness. Maybe it was opportunity. The more I considered, the less sense denial made. I barely slept. At dawn, I showered quickly and drove to the hospital for rounds, but my mind wasn't on patients. Normally, I'm meticulous. I record lab values, listen to lungs, catch subtleties in charts. That morning, I caught myself reading the same note 3 times without comprehension. My residents whispered about my distraction, but I ignored them. After shift, I went back to Margaret's. Eliza was there, acting as though nothing had happened. She even kissed my cheek. I felt her mother watching us like a hawk. Over dinner, Margaret said little, but her eyes shifted between us with every word spoken. When I tried again, quietly but firmly, to bring up the voice on the speaker, Eliza lashed out. She accused me of spying, of being paranoid, of working too many hours and inventing stories out of exhaustion. The gaslighting was textbook, and if I weren't trained to see patterns, I might have doubted myself. But Margaret's fork clattering onto the plate told me even she couldn't stomach the performance. Eliza eventually stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door. Margaret whispered to me that she didn't want to lose her daughter, but she couldn't defend what she had heard. She urged me to be careful, to find proof before I confronted again. You diagnose patients with tests, she said softly. Do the same here. Don't guess. Her words anchored me. I decided to treat this situation as I would a puzzling case. Start with symptoms, gather data, confirm with evidence. That night, I lay awake on the guest bed, listening to the creaks of the old house and the faint vibration of Eliza's phone upstairs. She thought she was clever muting her screen, but light leaks through cracks. I saw the glow under the door when I got up for water. She was messaging someone, her silhouette bent close to the device. I felt a tightening in my chest, not anger yet, but the slow burn of realization. The speaker had only confirmed what was already in motion. She was living 2 stories at once, one with me and her family, and another with whoever that voice belonged to. The doctor in me whispered patience. Collect labs, imaging, history. The man in me wanted to rip open the door and demand names. But Margaret's earlier plea steadied me. Evidence first. So I returned to bed, clenched my jaw, and began planning the investigation that would consume me over the next days. Because once you've heard the words, tell him you're seeing your sister. Come to the motel, you don't unhear them. The morning after the confrontation, I returned to the hospital heavy with the knowledge of what had happened, yet determined to mask it. Patients don't care if their doctor's life is cracking apart. They expect steadiness. So I slipped into routine, checked vitals, reviewed charts, adjusted dosages. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath it, every beep of a monitor echoed like a clock ticking down to some inevitable explosion. I drove back to Margaret's house late afternoon, telling myself I would act calm and detached. Eliza was already in the driveway, leaning on her car with her phone in hand. She greeted me as though the night before had been erased. The warmth in her tone felt rehearsed, too smooth, and I noticed she never asked about my shift. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. Inside, Margaret sat quietly in her chair, knitting without enthusiasm. She looked up at me, then at Eliza, and said nothing. Her silence was heavier than words. At dinner, Eliza excused herself mid-meal, claiming her sister had texted about an urgent matter. She slipped upstairs, her phone glowing again. Margaret's fork paused midair, and she met my eyes. I understood. The pattern was repeating. When Eliza returned, she said she needed to spend the weekend with her sister. She gave details too quickly, too polished, like she had memorized them. I listened, nodded, and pretended to believe. Inside, I cataloged every inconsistency. Her sister lived in another state, 2 hours away, yet Eliza claimed she would only be gone a few hours. Her story had holes wide enough for an ambulance to drive through. The next day at the hospital, while grabbing coffee in the staff lounge, I ran into Jonas Rowe, a pharmacist who had grown up with Eliza. He was older than me by a few years, with thinning hair and a nervous laugh. He mentioned seeing me around Margaret's place and said he hoped she was recovering well. Then, almost as an afterthought, he remarked, "Eliza's been restless lately. You know how she is when she's bored." The statement was casual, but his tone carried weight. My stomach tightened. I pressed lightly, asking what he meant. Jonas shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about late-night calls, about seeing her near the pharmacy once at odd hours. He didn't elaborate. Perhaps he realized he'd said too much, because he quickly changed the subject. Still, his words gnawed at me. Jonas had known Eliza since childhood. He wasn't prone to careless gossip. If he hinted at recklessness, it meant he'd seen something firsthand. That weekend, Eliza left for her sister's house. I stayed with Margaret, helping with her inhalers and monitoring her blood pressure. But by Saturday evening, my patience had thinned. I couldn't sit idly while lies piled higher. I decided to drive. Eliza's sister lived in Fairview, a small town 2 hours away, but something told me she hadn't gone there. Instead, I headed toward the highway that led to the string of roadside motels west of the city. My hunch wasn't scientific, but instinct often grows sharper when you've spent years listening to patients dodge the truth. I parked near one of the motels and waited. An hour passed. My doubts grew until I saw a car pull in, Eliza's. My pulse hammered. She stepped out, dressed far nicer than anyone visiting a sick relative. And she wasn't alone. A man joined her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jacket that looked too expensive for this setting. They walked inside together. I felt a hot wave of nausea and rage, but I forced myself to remain still. Bursting in without proof would accomplish nothing. Instead, I wrote down the time, the car description, the license plate. I snapped a photo from the shadows. Evidence, not emotion. But as I studied the man, recognition dawned. I'd seen him before, in a different context, at the hospital. He wasn't a doctor, but one of the suppliers who negotiated contracts for pharmaceuticals and equipment. His name came back to me slowly, Harold Whitmore. The betrayal deepened instantly. This wasn't just some random fling. This was a man who had authority over the hospital's supply chain. A man who had smiled in meetings and shaken my hand. The overlap between my professional life and personal life now felt like a noose tightening. I returned to Margaret's house late that night, my head buzzing. I didn't tell her what I had seen. Her health was fragile, and the truth would shatter her. But she sensed something anyway. Mothers often do. She asked if I'd eaten, and when I said no, she pressed a plate of toast into my hand with trembling fingers. The gesture almost broke me. On Sunday evening, Eliza returned home all smiles, claiming her sister had cooked too much food and insisting we eat leftovers. Margaret remained stone-faced. I forced myself through the meal, every bite tasting of ash. Later, when we were alone, Eliza tried to wrap her arms around me. The touch felt foreign. She smelled faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine. I stood rigid, and she pulled back, frowning, but didn't press. In the following days, more oddities surfaced. At the hospital, I overheard nurses whispering about seeing Eliza in the parking lot late at night. She didn't work there. Why would she be there unless she was meeting someone? Their hushed tones confirmed that others noticed her presence too. Meanwhile, I began to sense pressure from Harold himself. At a procurement meeting, he brought up new contracts for intravenous fluids and antibiotics. His eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, as though gauging whether I knew something. He made a point of mentioning how vital discretion was in business partnerships. His tone wasn't casual. It was layered, careful. I realized he might suspect I had seen him. And if that were the case, he wasn't simply worried about his affair with Eliza. There was more at stake. One night, as I reviewed patient charts, Margaret called from the living room. She had misplaced one of her pill bottles. When I checked her medication tray, I noticed a refill date didn't align. Pills were missing. At first I thought she'd forgotten, but she insisted she hadn't touched them since I'd last arranged them. The thought flickered. Could Eliza be taking them? For herself, or for someone else? I couldn't prove it, but the idea lodged like a splinter. And if Harold was involved, the possibility widened. Maybe this wasn't only about sex. Maybe medication was being diverted. The tension finally boiled over one evening when I pressed Eliza directly about her so-called visits. She snapped, accusing me of mistrust, of suffocating her with suspicion. She said I was obsessed with work, that I projected patient paranoia onto her. The argument escalated until she stormed out again. Margaret sat quietly afterward, her face lined with sorrow. She told me, in a voice thin with fatigue, that she feared her daughter was lost to a path neither of us could follow. She asked me not to give up on truth, even if it meant facing devastation. The next day, Jonas approached me again at the hospital pharmacy. He looked agitated. He mentioned he had seen Eliza with Harold near the loading docks late at night. His words were cautious, but the implication was clear. Something illicit was happening. He hinted at irregularities in medication orders, though he quickly clammed up, perhaps realizing the danger of speaking openly. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, piecing together threads. Eliza wasn't merely unfaithful. She was entangled in something larger, something that crossed into my professional world. Harold wasn't risking everything for lust alone. There had to be another layer, financial, criminal, or both. And Jonas, skittish as he was, clearly knew more than he said. I began to see the outline of a web, one that connected my fiancé, my workplace, and my own reputation. If I didn't act carefully, I could be dragged into scandal by association. The following weekend, Eliza once again announced she was visiting her sister. This time, I didn't stay behind. I told Margaret I needed to check something and promised to be careful. I followed Eliza's car from a distance, heart pounding, until she pulled into another roadside motel. Harold was there, waiting, but something was different this time. They weren't alone. Jonas emerged from a side door, glancing around nervously before slipping inside with them. My world tilted. Jonas, the nervous pharmacist who had dropped hints, was part of it. He wasn't a bystander. He was involved. I sat in the car, gripping the wheel, realizing I had stepped into something much darker than an affair. And as headlights passed on the road, I knew I couldn't reveal my hand yet. Evidence, patience, calculation, the very skills that saved lives in medicine, would now determine whether I could save my own. Sleep became an enemy. I would lie in bed at Margaret's, listening to the creaks of the house and the faint hum of her oxygen concentrator, unable to turn off the reel in my head. Eliza slipping into motels. Harold waiting like a shadow. Jonas, the nervous pharmacist, not just aware but involved. The triangle wasn't about love or lust alone. It had depth, the kind that corrodes careers and rots reputations. As a doctor, I've learned that when symptoms don't fit the obvious diagnosis, there's usually another condition hiding beneath. This wasn't simply an affair. It was the presenting complaint of a deeper sickness. The first signs surfaced at the hospital pharmacy. I noticed unusual shortages in medications that weren't normally scarce. Opioid painkillers, stimulants, even some antibiotics. At first, I assumed supply chain delays. But when I reviewed order logs, I saw duplicates and unexplained adjustments, slips that could be dismissed as clerical error if not for their frequency. Harold's signature appeared on several of the approvals. He had authority to expedite shipments, and on paper, everything looked routine. But the quantities ordered, paired with the shortages, suggested someone was diverting stock before it reached patients. I thought of Margaret's missing pills. It had seemed like a small error at the time, but now it slotted neatly into the pattern. At a procurement meeting, Harold played his role smoothly. He wore an immaculate suit, his voice steady, charming, like a salesman who knew he was winning. But when I glanced at him, he held my eyes for just a second too long. There was weight in that look, a challenge. I wondered if he sensed my suspicion. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. His tone was casual at first, speaking about budget cycles and supply costs. Then he leaned closer, his voice quieter, carrying an edge. He said discretion was important in our profession. Some things, he added, weren't worth digging into too deeply. It wasn't a threat in plain words, but the meaning was clear. He was testing me, warning me, both at once. I nodded like I understood, then walked away. But inside, the resolve hardened. If Harold was bold enough to hint at silence, it meant he felt secure or desperate. Either way, he was vulnerable. That evening, I returned to Margaret's. She was tired, her breathing shallow, and I adjusted her inhaler schedule. Eliza hovered, fussing over her mother, but with an anxious energy that felt artificial. She didn't mention her weekend away. I didn't either. When Eliza left the room, Margaret whispered to me that she felt something was being kept from her. She had known Harold years ago. In passing, he'd sponsored a hospital fundraiser. She said she never liked him. Too smooth, too eager to impress. She looked at me with watery eyes and asked if her daughter was mixed up with him. I couldn't lie to her. I didn't give details, but I admitted Eliza wasn't where she claimed to be on weekends. Margaret closed her eyes, as though she had expected it all along. The following week, I dug deeper. At the hospital, I requested to review medication discrepancy reports under the pretext of researching patient safety. Buried in spreadsheets and logs, I found inconsistencies that lined up with nights Eliza was absent. Patterns emerged. Certain shipments went missing, always routed through Harold's channels, always on weekends. Jonas's name appeared too, tucked into digital signatures for pharmacy clearances. That was the final piece. Jonas wasn't just aware. He was complicit. I decided to test him. I approached Jonas at the hospital cafe, asking casually about inventory issues. His face drained of color. He stammered excuses about staffing shortages, paperwork errors, anything but the truth. His eyes darted around the room as if someone might be listening. Then, in a low voice, he told me I should be careful. He said Eliza was in deeper than I thought, that Harold wasn't someone to cross. He didn't admit guilt outright, but his fear betrayed him. Before I could press further, he excused himself and hurried out, leaving his coffee untouched. That night, Eliza tried to act affectionate, cooking dinner and talking about wedding plans as if nothing were fractured between us. I studied her. Every word she said measured against the knowledge I held. Her laugh sounded too forced, her eyes too restless. When she leaned close, I caught a whiff of the same cologne I'd noticed before, Harold's, most likely. I thought of confronting her directly then and there. But Margaret's frail form in the other room stopped me. A shouting match would devastate her. Worse, it would tip my hand before I had enough to expose the full scope. So I smiled faintly, nodded, and tucked the information deeper inside. The turning point came when Margaret collapsed. It happened suddenly, one evening after dinner. She clutched her chest, her face pale, gasping for breath. I rushed to her side, checked vitals, and realized her oxygen saturation had dropped dangerously. We rushed her to the hospital. I worked alongside the ER team, my hands steady despite the panic in my chest. After stabilizing her, I reviewed her medication bottles. Something was wrong. One of her inhalers looked tampered with, the dosage off, the contents inconsistent. I froze. If she had been given altered medication, her collapse wasn't just illness. It was negligence or sabotage, and Eliza had been the one managing her prescriptions when I wasn't around. The suspicion became unbearable. I followed Eliza the next weekend. I kept my distance, trailing her car to another motel. This time, I was more careful, parking far enough that she wouldn't notice. From my vantage, I saw her enter with Harold. Minutes later, Jonas slipped inside as well. 3 of them, together. I moved closer, heart pounding, and crouched near a side window. The blinds didn't fully close. Inside, papers were spread across the bed. Not love letters, not romantic trysts, documents, invoices, pill bottles. I saw Jonas handling small boxes, Harold pointing at figures, Eliza flipping through files. My breath caught. This wasn't an affair in isolation. It was a scheme, one involving stolen medication, falsified orders, and likely profits funneled off the hospital's supply chain. And Eliza, my fiancée, was in the middle of it. I lifted my phone to take photos. The angle was poor, but I caught enough. Harold leaning over papers, Eliza holding a pen, Jonas clutching a box. Proof. My hand shook as I pressed capture. But then the door opened. Footsteps. Voices. Someone stepped outside for air, Jonas. He lit a cigarette, glanced around, and for a terrifying moment his eyes swept over the darkness where I crouched. My lungs locked. He exhaled smoke, muttered to himself, and re-entered. I remained frozen for minutes, certain I had been spotted. When I finally slipped away, sweat clung cold to my back. Back at Margaret's, I locked myself in the guest room, heart still racing. I reviewed the photos. They weren't perfect, but they showed enough to prove collusion. The risk I had taken gnawed at me. If Jonas had truly seen me, if Harold suspected, I could be in danger. Not physical, perhaps, but professional ruin, public scandal, accusations twisted against me. The next day at work, Harold approached me in the corridor. His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were sharp. He asked if everything was all right at home. The question was loaded, too precise. My throat went dry. Did he know? Was he fishing? I forced a smile and said Margaret was improving. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as though he'd heard something I hadn't said aloud. Then he clapped my shoulder and walked away. The message was clear. He was watching. That night, Margaret asked me directly if Eliza was in danger. She had seen enough whispers, enough tension, to know something dark was unfolding. I told her gently that Eliza was making choices that could harm everyone. Margaret wept softly, ashamed and afraid. She said she wished she had raised her daughter differently. I stayed by her side until she slept, my resolve hardening with every breath she took. This wasn't only about betrayal anymore. Margaret's health had been endangered, the hospital's integrity compromised, and my own career hung by a thread. I thought of the patients I'd sworn to protect, the oath I had taken. If Harold and Jonas were bleeding the system dry for profit, if Eliza was their willing accomplice, silence would make me complicit too. So I decided, the next time they met, I wouldn't just observe. I would intervene. By the time the next weekend arrived, I had rehearsed every possible outcome in my head. Confrontation in the open-wrist chaos. Silence was unbearable. Evidence existed, but half measures wouldn't cut it. I needed one decisive moment where truth collided with consequence. Eliza announced again she was heading to her sister's. Margaret sat stiffly in her chair, staring at the wall as though she'd heard the line too many times to stomach it anymore. I told Eliza I had a late shift. She kissed my cheek with the same routine smile and left. The moment her taillights vanished, I rose, grabbed my keys, and told Margaret to rest. She looked at me with weary eyes. She didn't ask where I was going. Maybe she knew. I followed Eliza at a careful distance, headlights dimmed, every nerve buzzing. She drove west, past the city, past gas stations and diners, until she pulled into the same motel as before. Harold's car was already there. Jonas's small sedan appeared minutes later. I parked a block away and walked, sticking to shadows. The night air was cool, but sweat soaked my collar. This time, I didn't stop outside the window. I marched straight to the door. My heart pounded, but my stride didn't falter. I knocked once hard. Muffled voices inside froze. Then the door cracked open, Eliza's face pale and startled. "Patrick," she began, but I pushed past her into the room. Inside, Harold stood by the bed, papers scattered across it. Jonas sat in a chair, clutching a cigarette he hadn't lit. All 3 froze like thieves caught under a floodlight. For a moment, silence reigned. I let it stretch, every second choking them. Then I spoke, steady, each word deliberate. "I know everything." Eliza's voice shook as she tried to spin excuses. She said it wasn't what it looked like, that Harold was helping her with something, that Jonas was just delivering supplies. Lies stacked on lies. Harold remained calm, too calm. He straightened his jacket, met my eyes, and said I was making a mistake. He warned me that interfering could destroy more than just my relationship. His tone carried authority, the same smooth persuasion he used in boardrooms. Jonas looked ready to collapse. His hands trembled. He muttered that none of this was his idea, that he had been dragged in. His guilt leaked through every stammer. I cut through their noise. I pulled out my phone and dropped it on the bed. The screen lit with photos I had taken through the window. Harold bent over invoices, Eliza holding boxes, Jonas scribbling notes. You think I came here blind? I said. I've got records, dates, signatures. You've been diverting medications. And you, I looked at Eliza, have been covering it with lies. Her face crumpled. She tried to step toward me, pleading that it wasn't about betrayal, that she had gotten trapped. But I saw no trap, only choices. Harold's mask slipped. His calm turned sharp, his voice a growl. He accused me of violating privacy, of fabricating stories, of risking defamation. He said he could bury me professionally if I dared take this further. But he didn't know that I had already acted. Before coming here, I'd sent copies of the photos and my notes to Dr. Ruth Alvarez, my colleague at the hospital who was part of the internal investigation into medication theft. She was trustworthy, meticulous, and relentless. Even if I disappeared, the evidence wouldn't. I told Harold this. His eyes flickered, the first crack in his armor. Jonas sank into his chair, muttering curses under his breath. His guilt was boiling over. He finally blurted that Harold had promised protection, that Eliza had convinced him it would be safe, that they were in too deep to back out now. Eliza shouted at him to shut up, her voice desperate. But the damage was done. Their alliance fractured before my eyes. I turned to leave, but Harold blocked the door. His voice was low, dangerous. He said if I walked out, I'd regret it. That no one would believe a tired doctor over a respected supplier. I didn't flinch. I told him the board already had the files. By morning, they would act. If he wanted to salvage anything, his best option was to step aside quietly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Eliza broke it, sobbing, insisting she never meant to hurt me. She claimed Harold had pressured her, that Jonas had orchestrated paperwork, that she had just been a pawn. Her words tumbled out, messy, frantic. I looked at her, the woman I had once planned a life with, and felt only emptiness. Love cannot survive when trust is poisoned. I stepped past Harold, opened the door, and walked into the night. Behind me, voices rose in chaos, accusations, denials, panic. But I didn't turn back. The fallout was swift. By Monday morning, Harold was suspended pending investigation. The board moved fast once Dr. Alvarez presented the files. Contracts were frozen, audits launched, and whispers filled the hospital halls. Jonas resigned before he could be dismissed. Rumors swirled of pharmacy licenses under review, of charges being prepared. His nervous demeanor had betrayed him long before, and now his career collapsed. And Eliza? She didn't come home. Margaret waited with quiet devastation, asking me each day if I had heard from her daughter. Eventually, Eliza's name surfaced in reports too, not as a victim, but as an accomplice. Margaret wept. She wasn't surprised, but sorrow weighs heavier when confirmed. I stayed by her side, not as a fiancé anymore, but as a doctor, as someone unwilling to abandon her even when her daughter had. At the hospital, colleagues whispered about my role in exposing the scheme. Some admired it, others avoided me, wary of proximity to scandal. Administrators thanked me, though in clipped, cautious tones. My work was suddenly under a brighter spotlight, every action scrutinized. Harold, stripped of authority, faced not only dismissal but legal charges. His arrogance had shielded him for years, but evidence doesn't bend to charm forever. Eliza tried contacting me once. A late-night message, full of apologies and promises, claiming she had been lost and manipulated. I didn't answer. Silence can be more final than words. Margaret improved slowly. Her lungs cleared, her strength returned in increments. She thanked me often, though her eyes carried guilt that her daughter had brought this upon us. I told her gently it wasn't her fault. Adults choose their paths, and Eliza had chosen hers. As weeks passed, life regained rhythm. Hospital rounds, paperwork, late dinners. But beneath it all lingered scars, the memory of a voice through a speaker, of lies unraveling, of love turned weapon. The consequences spread like ripples. Harold faced indictment. Jonas vanished from town, reputation in tatters. Eliza, stripped of credibility, drifted into obscurity. Margaret, though wounded emotionally, grew closer to me than ever, our bond forged through shared pain. And me? I carried forward, more cautious, less naive. Trust once broken reshapes a man. But medicine has taught me resilience. Wounds heal, though they leave marks. When I stood again in the same kitchen where it began, chopping onions under quiet light, the Bluetooth speaker sat silent. The memory of that voice remained, but it no longer defined me. The story hadn't ended the way I once dreamed. But endings don't ask for permission. They arrive, and you either collapse or adapt. I chose to adapt.